Okay, so what we're going to talk about now is we're going to talk about this idea of reflexes. And so what we need to begin with is this first question: what is a reflex? And so they're rapid and they're automatic, meaning involuntary, responses to a stimuli. Okay, so for example, when you touch a hot stove, your hand immediately jerks away before you even think about it. Okay. A couple of other things that it says in here is that they generally show very little variation. So every time you get a stimulus, the reflex should respond in the same way every time. Okay. And so, again, if we're looking here in our notes packets, there's some things that I want to make sure you know. So define a reflex. So rapid, involuntary response to a stimulus. Okay. And I want to point this out because this is something that often trips up students. So it's an involuntary response. But can a reflex ever use voluntary muscles that you can choose to control under some circumstances? So if I touch a hot stove and I pull my arm away, that's a reflex. I used my skeletal muscles of my arm, which means that, yes, in that instance it was involuntary, but I can choose to control my arm. So yes, a reflex can use muscles that are voluntary in other circumstances. So that's what's the difference between a reflex and voluntary movement. It's just the reflex response is involuntary, even though sometimes those muscles can be consciously controlled. Okay. So which occurs more quickly, reflexes or voluntary movement? Well, hopefully from your own experiences, you know reflexes happen a lot more quickly. My hand will often pull away from the hot stove before it's even gone to my conscious perception. And our skeletal muscles that are part of reflex arcs are part of the somatic nervous system. Yes, they definitely are. Okay, so we're still talking somatic nervous system. It's just sometimes those muscles we can choose to control, but in a reflex situation, we have no control. Okay, it's involuntary. So it turns out there's different types of reflexes. We can categorize them in these 4 ways, and on your homework it gives you more information here. So this is how reflexes can be classified. Okay, so innate means that they're genetically determined. So that would be the example I just gave of withdrawal from pain. That's something that we're born doing. Okay, but an acquired reflex is something that we learn. So for example, if you drive a car, it may be that something comes at you and you just, without even thinking, slam on the brakes. That would be a learned reflex. Or it may be that if you're used to driving around with small children, that if you slam on the brakes at the same time, you throw out your arm to keep the child or loved one from falling into the windshield. And that you may do without thinking. You may do that when there's not even anybody in the car because it's just this thing that a learned response. So we can be born with it or we can learn it over time. A somatic reflex means that we're using skeletal muscles. A visceral or autonomic reflex means that we're using smooth or cardiac muscle, glands, or adipose tissue. Okay, so slamming on the brakes, that uses skeletal muscles, so that would be a somatic reflex. On the other hand, say if you have, I guess a visceral reflex would be that as soon as food hits your stomach, it immediately starts secreting digestive juices, stomach acid, to start digesting things. You don't choose to control that. Okay. Complexity of the circuit. So monosynaptic means mono means one, so one synapse. Polysynaptic means multiple synapses. This is one you can't really intuit by a description. You have to see the diagram, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. Okay. And then you have the difference between spinal reflexes and cranial reflexes. Essentially, this means, are we using spinal nerves, and therefore the stimulus to response only goes through the spinal cord, or are we using cranial nerves, so stimulus and response passes through the brain? Okay, and this shows you here, if we're talking about cranial reflexes, here we're using cranial nerves, so we go to the brain. And if we're talking about spinal reflexes, they use spinal nerves, so they only go to the spinal cord. Okay, and so what I do now is I would go here to this chart and see, based on what we just talked about, can you fill it in? So for example, how the reflex is classified based on development, it's either innate or learned. Some books call it instead acquired. Okay, and examples that we talked about: withdrawal from pain, and the example we talked about here is to slam on brakes in certain driving situations. Okay, so see if based on what we talked about you can go through and look at each of these and come up with your own example here. An example, I will give you this because we hadn't talked about it yet. Spinal reflexes versus cranial reflexes. An example of a spinal reflex would really be anything using muscles in your arms and legs. Those are going to go through the spinal cord. So slamming on the brakes, that's going to go through the spinal cord. But cranial reflex instead could be, say if you get sand in your eyes and you're going to start blinking automatically, blinking of eyes. Okay, that's actually going to go through cranial nerves from your eyes to the brain and then back to those muscles there. Okay, so muscles of the eyelids. So that would be an example of a cranial reflex. Okay, and so what you should know is that every reflex, you would pick one of these words to describe it. So let's look at a specific reflex here. So one of the specific ones, let's actually go to the withdrawal reflex. This is withdrawing from pain, is one of the types. Okay, and if we categorize it, we can use all of those terms. It's innate, meaning we're born with it. Somatic, meaning using skeletal muscles. And spinal, it's going to go through the spinal cord. Now let's look at this polysynaptic. How do we tell that? Well, here, each of these lines, so here we've got this red line. You see a little cell body off to the side and a red line here. Okay, so this is one sensory neuron. Okay, and every place it connects with another neuron, it does so through a synapse. So here it connects with a white neuron, so that's one synapse. Okay, here this white neuron, it's actually divergence, and it's connecting with more than one black neurons. And so that is going to be at least, so we had one synapse, 2, 3. Turns out we've got another one here with a blue neuron, 4. So this is at least 4 synapses. So definitely polysynaptic. Now, there's no way to intuit this. They're going to be able to know this. Scientists actually had to research this and physically look to see how many neurons, how many synapses were involved in this process. So it's something that is experimentally determined because they look. So if you're asked this, you would have to be given some sort of information. You can't just kind of figure it out on your own. One thing that I want to point out here that's important while we're on this withdrawal from pain is that you notice one stimulus comes in and then we get divergence and we go to muscles on two sides of the arm. Well, the reason why we do that is, say for example, I touch a painful stimulus. Okay, I want these muscles on top to contract, but these muscles on bottom I want to relax because I want to move these two bones relative to each other. Okay, I don't want to keep, if this muscle is contracting, it's pulling this bone down, and that would keep me at the stimulus. Okay. Now, this is an example where stimulus and all responses, one set of muscles contract, the other relax. It's all on the same side of the body. So stimulus comes into right hand and muscles on the right arm contract and relax. So when that happens, when they are on the same side of the body, we are going to call that ipsilateral. And that means stimulus and responses on the same side of the body. Okay. Now let's look at a different one. Here, the crossed extensor reflex. In this, we've stepped on a tack. Stimulus comes up, we get divergence, and we have one set of muscles, okay, that are stimulated and inhibited that pull this leg that was on the tack up, but at the same time you want to stimulate muscles in this other leg so you can put your weight back on it so you don't fall down. Okay. So this is where stimulus happens on one side of the body. Some of the responses are on one side, but some are actually also on the other side. And so that is called contralateral. And that means not all responses are on the same side of the body. Okay. All right. One other thing I want to point out, the stretch reflex. This is an example of a monosynaptic reflex. And again, we look at the diagram of the arc. In this case, muscle tension is kept constant. We have this sensory region in every muscle. Okay. We have these special muscle fibers called interfusal muscle fibers. Okay, together they're called a muscle spindle. And they're going to send sensations about how contracted this muscle is to the central nervous system. So, say the doctor comes and taps this ligament with a little instrument here. That stretches the muscle. And so the muscle sends that information to the spinal cord and it says, oh my goodness, we are overstretched. And so it will then send a motor command back to these extrafusal fibers, which are the part of the muscle that actually contract. And it is going to contract, and that pulls the leg up. Okay. Now if we look, we've got one red sensory neuron. Here's the cell body. We synapse onto a black neuron, and that goes to the effectors. So count our synapses. One synapse. Alright? And so that's why it's monosynaptic. Okay? And so that would be the stretch reflex. Okay? So make sure you read through this information, that you understand the purposes of all of these reflexes. Go through your sheets, make sure you can classify each of these reflexes using one word from each of these four categories, and define ipsilateral and contralateral as well.